the best political campaign slogan I've ever seen. Give 'em Helen. And I did want to say to Helen Brady, she may not think she speaks well, but anyone who speaks from the heart, as she does, speaks well, and I wish her the very best with her campaign to clean up Massachusetts. Now, as I understand it, you are for some reason concerned that you're paying too much taxes. Have I, Chairman, understood this ungenerous approach correctly? Well, of course you're paying too much taxes. And one of the reasons why you're paying too much taxes is that the national and international left, and I'm going to use the word communist left because increasingly that is what they are. And I come from Yorkshire where they call a spade a bloody shovel. So if he walks like a communist, and talks like a communist, and looks like a communist, behaves like a communist, and has policy like a communist, then maybe it's a communist. And the communists have decided, as all totalitarians do, that what they want to do is to gain absolute control over every aspect of every person's life. Even your personal life, even what you do in your own garden. They want to control it. And it was that arch-totalitarian, Adolf Hitler, who first realized and wrote down in that ghastly work, Mein Kampf, that if you want to control every aspect of the people's lives, the best way to do it is through environmental policy. Because then you can tell them what plants they can grow, what food they can eat, how often they can fart. You can literally control absolutely everything that they do. And so when the Berlin Wall came down, and suddenly communism was briefly out of fashion, the communists had to find some way to regroup and once again worm their way into the affection of the West so that they could undermine it like a canker from within. And the method that they chose was to infiltrate the environmental movement and take it over. And the most prominent organization in the environmental movement was called Greenpeace. It was a foundation which was started, among others, by my old friend, Dr. Patrick Moore, who was a genuine environmentalist. There are still a few, thank God, who actually care about the environment more than they care about the destruction of capitalism. And in fact, Patrick Moore was only about caring for the environment, and he led Greenpeace, and he led very successful campaigns with which all of us would wholeheartedly agree to stop the extinction of whales by whaling, and to stop the brutal clubbing of seals. And these campaigns succeeded because they had merit and they were proper environmental concerns. But he said to me one day, he said, I realized that I was going to have to leave Greenpeace when the Marxists, and that was the word he used, sort of, that had infiltrated the organization, decided they were going to mount a campaign against chromium. And he said, you can't make a campaign against one of the elements in the periodic table. It is what it is. And he said, at that moment I realized with great regret that the movement that I had helped to found and that I had led, and that had been intended to be concerned with the environment, had been captured by people that we could not control because we were not political, and they were. They knew how to do stuff and take the organization over. We couldn't stop them. And I realized it was no longer an environmental organization. It was a communist, and that was his word, a communist political organization. And I and many other founders quietly left. And indeed, they've now spoken out, particularly Patrick, so vigorously against what Greenpeace has now become, the green-eyed monster that it's become, that they've tried to airbrush it literally out of photographs showing the founders of Greenpeace. They've tried to make it look as though he was never there. The technique that you remember the Russians used to use when somebody who had formerly been in favour with the Central Committee, Politburo and the Commissars fell out of favour, and they airbrushed these people out of the photographs and disappeared them completely. Down the memory hole they went. So when we look at the question of climate change, which is one of the reasons why you are paying 6 times as much for electrical power and 4 times as much for gasoline as you would be paying were there no scare about climate change. We are not talking primarily about concern for the environment on the part of those who are peddling the climate change mantra. We are talking about instead a sullen and vicious ambition to destroy capitalism, and in particular to destroy the United States of America, a country which I, on my frequent visits here, have come to admire and to love. So I want to make sure that these wretches do not succeed. And for many years, I have been pointing out, as have many of my friends, the obvious defects in their argument. But I came to realize 3 years ago when I was attending the World Federation of Scientists, and I listened to a speech by Professor Will Happer, whom some of you will know. He said he had proven that they had exaggerated the warming from CO2, the direct warming from CO2, by about 40%. Now that makes quite a difference to the numbers. But what fascinated me was that he said he'd proven it. Now they're trying to pretend he hasn't proven it because it's unfortunately an extremely complicated proof which involves a very detailed knowledge of his specialism, which is optical physics. So he has not managed to get his proof published. But I thought, I wonder if I could find a way of proving, using physics and mathematics, that they have got their sums wrong, and that therefore there's going to be a lot less global warming than they have been so confidently predicting. And they tell you, for instance, there's a consensus, a 97% consensus, that it's all going to be gloom and doom. First of all, the consensus proposition, as defined by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, says no more than that recent warming was mostly man-made. That may or may not be true. But what is very true is that of 11,944 papers on climate and related topics published in the 21 years 1991 to 2011, only 41, or 0.3%, actually stated that recent global warming was mostly man-made, or words to that effect. Yet the left-wing, they were communists, open communists, who wrote this paper saying that there was a 97.1% consensus from those 11,944 papers. They reported this 0.3% consensus as 97.1%. And those of you who are accountants will realize that they may have perhaps got their decimal point in the wrong place and point else wrong beside. So what went on? Well, what went on was they simply lied. Because I, after much bullying, persuaded them to cough up the entire data sheet of all 11,944 papers, together with how they had marked these papers as to whether or not they agreed with the consensus proposition as they had defined it. And they themselves had marked only 64 of these papers as saying that global warming is mostly man-made, 0.5%. When I read all 64 papers, only 41 of them had actually said what they said they'd said. So they had simply lied, and I have proof that they lied. And so I went to a senior citizen of Queensland, whose university had provided the nest of vipers from which these creatures came. And I said, I think you should report this as fraud to the police. So he said, do me an affidavit in the form that they would like to see, and I will go and see them, because I'm not Australian, I can't go and talk to the police about stuff like this. So he went in, and he saw the police commissioner, and he said, look, here's this affidavit. These people have simply made stuff up, and it's been very influential. Mr. Obama has quoted this paper. And the police said, we'll have a look at it. And they got back to him and they said, we dare not prosecute because this is a subject which has become political, but we will tell you this, we have investigated the facts, and it is very clear that there was a deliberate deception on the part of those who published that paper. So we're dealing with communists who will lie because totalitarians always do. The party line is the only truth they recognize. And anything that is further of the party line, they will lie about it because they simply have no concept of the moral distinction between that which is true and that which is not. But using that moral distinction, which is also a distinction in logic, in mathematics, and therefore in science, because language is mathematics, my team of distinguished professors and doctors of science, there are 10 of us, we've been working on this for a couple of years now, have discovered a giant error right at the heart of their calculations of how much global warming we will get per doubling of the CO2 concentration in the atmosphere. That's the standard yardstick that they use. How much will the planet warm if you double the CO2? Now, the official figures say that it will be somewhere between 1.5 and 4.5 Celsius, with the best estimate from models at the moment of about 3.5. Those are the official numbers. And it all sounds faintly scary. Not very scary, but they say very scary. We say not really. I wanted to know whether that range of estimates had any scientific plausibility. And so I began to dig. And the first thing I discovered, which was very interesting, was that even they admitted that only just over 1 Celsius on global warming, 1.0363 to be precise at the moment, would be caused directly by putting the carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. Now that wasn't scary enough for them, so they had to bump it up somehow. And the device that they used to bump it up was to say, ooh, if you warm the atmosphere, then various processes in the atmosphere will occur which will cause knock-on additional warming. And that's called climate feedback or temperature feedback. Now the concept of feedback is well understood in a branch of physics called control theory or systems theory. And it was first developed at Bell Labs, then in New York in the 1920s and 30s by Harold S. Black, and was codified in a paper by him in 1934, and then in a textbook by his colleague Hendrik Wade Bird in 1945, a textbook so popular in the age before digitization of electronic circuits and amplifiers that it became the standard textbook and went through several editions every year for the following 20 or 30 years. So the mathematics of feedback is very well understood in control theory, and it was borrowed explicitly by, I'm afraid to say, another communist, this time James Hansen, who was the director of the Goddard Institute for Space Studies at NASA. And in a very bad and thoroughly muddled paper of 1984, he introduced the notion of the control theory version of feedback into climate studies. A friend of his, another communist, now married wherever they put communists when they die, called Michael Schlesinger, wrote another muddled paper in 1985, entrenching this notion into the literature, and ever since everybody has copied the way that these two communists did these calculations. Now what I can't work out is whether these communists made the mistake I'm about to reveal to you deliberately or accidentally. What I will say is that the mistake so subtle and yet so catastrophic in its effect on the calculation that I can almost, but not quite, forgive climatology for having failed to spot it until we spotted it just about a year ago. And we've been working ever since on refining it and, very importantly, on proving that what we have discovered is so. Proving to a level of clarity and truth which is equal to that of Pythagoras' theorem. Because we reckon that nothing else than an absolute, irrefutable, mathematical and physical proof would bring this climate scare, which has been going on for 40 years now, to an unlamented and very final end. And that is what we think we've done. So I'm going to describe, just in outline, the nature of the error that they have made. Now for this you have to understand a simple concept called a feedback loop. You have an input signal. Think of it as an electronic circuit, because that's how this was first worked out, because you can measure electronic circuits very easily. You have an input signal coming in from the left. It goes to what is called a summative node, where whatever goes in from various directions is added together. And then it goes around a loop. And in that loop, there is a thing called a feedback block. And the feedback block has in it a thing called the feedback factor. And the feedback factor is simply the fraction of the output signal over here on the right that is represented by the feedback response, the response to that feedback. So that is the feedback loop, and every time the signal goes around the loop, it is multiplied by the feedback factor, and it goes an infinite number of times around that loop. And therefore you end up with the input signal multiplied by the sum of all the powers of the feedback factor from f to the power 0, which is 1, time a plus f to the power 1, which is f, then f squared, f cubed, f to the fourth, f to the fifth, all the way up to f to the infinity. You might think, gosh, that's complicated. How do you add that up? Well, that turns out to be a very famous convergent infinite series. You've probably never met one of those stuff. But all it is that when you add all that up, it comes out to a very nice tidy total of 1 divided by 1 minus f. And we call that the system gain factor. And that is simply the ratio of the output signal over here to the input signal over there, and the difference between the two is caused by the feedback. And this is essentially a linear approximation to what goes on in an electronic circuit. And that's how mathematics work. So you have, to simplify it all, the input signal here, multiplied by the system gain factor in the middle, which represents the feedback loop, and that gives you the output signal. Now this mathematics is universal in all dynamical systems, and those are systems which can be described in mathematics which change their state over time. And these dynamical systems, if they have feedbacks moderating them, the feedback mathematics I have just described applies just as much to an electronic circuit as to a control process in a factory as to the climate. In the climate, for instance, the only feedback that matters is the water vapor feedback, because as the space occupied by the atmosphere warms, it is capable of carrying near exponentially more water vapor, about 7% extra per Kelvin. In reality, however, that increase is observed only at or near the surface, where increasing the water vapor doesn't make any difference because you've got clouds and convection and all sorts of other stuff going on that effectively extinguish its effect. Further up, where the models predict, you go 6 miles up, in the mid-troposphere, the tropics, where they predict that the water vapor feedback really comes into its own, because they say that there will be a tripling of the surface warming rate in the tropics if you go 6 miles up. That is not observed in reality in almost any data set. And that means they're wrong about the water vapor feedback. All the other feedbacks don't matter because they, broadly speaking, self-cancel in the current scientific understanding. So what these creatures had done wrong when they first described the mathematics of the feedback loop is that they had thought that feedbacks only reacted to changes in the input signal, so that you've got a change in the output signal. They did not realize that feedbacks also react to the entire input signal, and therefore you get a different entire output signal. So the equation they're using, which simply has the change that we cause in the input signal, the reference temperature before feedback, and the change in the equilibrium temperature, which is the temperature after feedback, that equation is a correct equation. This is why nobody previously spotted what they did wrong. But by excluding the fact that the equation using the full, entire or absolute input signal, the reference temperature, and the output signal, the entire output signal, if you realize that that equation is correct, and their official definition of feedback excludes that possibility, but in control theory it is definitely so, then you can immediately find the holy grail of climate sensitivity studies, which is that system gain factor. How much should you multiply the direct warming from CO2 in order to get the final warming or equilibrium warming, which is the sensitivity they're all looking for. And we've done this calculation. First of all, for 1850, we've worked out the reference temperature was 255 Kelvin, and the equilibrium temperature was simply the temperature that was measured, because that was the first year in which we measured global temperature, 287.5 Kelvin. So the ratio, which is your system gain factor, is 287.5 over 255, and that is 1.13. We then repeated the calculation for 2011 to make sure things hadn't changed very much, because some of these feedbacks can be non-linear. And the answer was still 1.13. So you multiply that by the 1.04 Kelvin, which is the direct warming from CO2, and you get 1.17 Kelvin as the correct answer for how much warming you get per doubling of CO2. Not 1.5, not 3, not 4.5, not the 10 Kelvin that some silly papers are saying. It's just over 1 Kelvin. It is just about 2 Fahrenheit per doubling of CO2, and that takes place over a period of between 100 and 150 years. So this calculation, which is absolutely definitive, there is no argument that can possibly be made against it, and it's now out for peer review, and we're waiting to hear. Of course, the first thing that happened is the editor of the journal concerned, who doesn't want to publish this, said, he said, we can't find any reviewers competent to review your paper. Please, could you rewrite the paper in simpler mathematics? So what I did was we took out all the stuff about the sum of an infinite series, because that was simply too much for your average climatologist. I mean, they don't know very much mathematics or physics, it's too difficult. They're used to sticking out their hand out of the window to see whether it's raining or not, and that's about as far as they go scientifically. So we rewrote it all in baby mathematics. In fact, we managed to reduce the entire argument to nothing more than high school algebra. So we sent it in again, and that was a few weeks ago, and they've gone quiet. And so we think, and we sent them a long list of people who have always got this wrong in the past, and who are the IPCC's leading stars in climate sensitivity studies. We said, send it to them. We said, we don't care whether they got it wrong in the past or not. We think they should be confronted with what we say we have proven is the truth, and let them come back and dare to tell you otherwise. So we have thrown down the challenge, and we will see whether or not they pick it up. But we've done one other thing, and this is where you can actually come in and do a very great deal to help us. Now, first of all, having heard the account that I've given, are you game to help us here?
Yes.
Are you willing to help us?
Yes.
I didn't hear that.
Yes.
That's better. Right. So here is what I've done. I wrote.
We're just about out of time.
Exactly. I wrote
Let him talk.
to the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, and I said, I'm reporting you for an error. You have an error reporting protocol. I'm reporting that this is an error. It underlies all your previous reports. You're going to have to rewrite a lot. Please, under that protocol, acknowledge that I have reported this error to you. They have not, in 3 weeks, replied at all. From the moment they were told of this error, and they failed to activate their own error reporting protocol, they were guilty of corruption and fraud. What I want you to do is to write to the Swiss ambassador and tell him so, and ask him formally to send the paperwork that I shall make available to this group to the Swiss Federal Police to investigate this fraud and bring it finally to an end by expelling the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change from Switzerland. Are you with me on this?
Yes.
I conclude, for my 20 minutes is more or less exactly up, I conclude by saying this, that it is only because the United States exists as a beacon of freedom to the rest of us that I have even bothered to try to do any of this. In Europe now we are stifled by socialism, crippled by communism. Here there are still organisations such as yours, where you give up your time because you want to retain the liberty that your founding fathers wanted you to have and wanted you to pass on to your posterity. And it matters very much to me that you should do this. And so I'm going to end by saying to you what Winston Churchill said to your president in the darkest hour of the Second World War. Sail on, O ship of state. Sail on, O Union, strong and great. Humanity, with all its fears, with all the hopes of future years, is hanging breathless on thy fate. Thank you.